Considered by many to be a spectacular failure at launch, Cyberpunk 2077 fought flesh and chrome to come back, and after 3 years finally released its first and only DLC, Phantom Liberty. The base game was so buggy and broken at launch that Sony and Microsoft refused to sell it on their PlayStation and Xbox store until it was resolved. This, of course, after the game was delayed and delayed and delayed again. Some of you may be asking why this video even exists. If the game was so bad at launch, why would anyone care? The answer being, because for all its trouble and all the issues, CD Projekt Red ended up delivering a masterpiece, as well as a masterclass in humility and not giving up on a game after a failed launch. With Cyberpunk 2.0 and the Phantom Liberty expansion, the world of Cyberpunk opens up almost a completely new game, with original game promises being delivered, new places to explore, and breathing life into a game that was almost zeroed at launch. The help it received from its anime adaptation, Edgerunners, was also a huge win for CDPR and the Cyberpunk Video Game Franchise. Is all this new tech and body mod enough to win over players burned by the catastrophic launch, or did CDPR attempt to paint a corpse chrome? Let's jack into the net and find out in Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty's loop. The gameplay of Phantom Liberty is very similar to the base game, and very similar to most other first and third-person shooter RPGs. You traverse the world, shoot things, spend money on illegal favors, and partake in the extravagance of the world you're in. Cyberpunk is in a league of its own, or at least it was until a certain Bethesda title recently launched. The technobabble, neon, and RGB landscape of the game is far and away a different near future than what Starfield set out to do, unless you go to a certain planet in that game. Here, though, Night City shines in its careless attitude for the world around it. There are plenty of spectacular views, but much like real cities in the world, the seedy underbelly is never far away. This may sound ridiculous, but playing this game felt like a future in my hometown of Chicago in a lot of ways. The socioeconomic diversity, the history versus the modern, all different walks of life, and of course organized crime, even though Al Capone wouldn't be caught dead in some of the lavish and oftentimes outlandish style of Night City. Much of the DLC in particular feels like more of the same for Cyberpunk. CD Projekt Red didn't lose sight of what the fans of the base game loved, but gave us enough of a change to still feel at home while also feeling like a completely different game. Side missions still have the same in-world feel, both dramatic and humorous, that the company nailed in the base game. The options for underworld shenanigans, both through the fixers in the neighborhoods and the random people on the street, can drag you on long tangents of the main game that leave you immersed in the world and stories of the characters around you. Gunplay feels a bit better overall, though just tighter, not vastly changed. Many of the combat skills have been reworked to fit better together, while also feeling distinct and earned in some cases. The rework of the talent system and what feels like snappier starts to combat allow for a much more fluid playstyle than the base game allowed for. Driving in this game feels more fluid as well. Different cars feel distinctly different as they did previously, but new vehicles and overall better controls make driving in Cyberpunk feel like less of a chore than it previously did. Cornering in fast-moving vehicles doesn't feel like a vomit-inducing spin anymore. Though while some cars feel tighter, others are meant to be wild and uncontrolled, and that has not changed with some of the super and hypercar equivalents sprinkled throughout Night City. One thing about these games when comparing to some others in the genre is the hurry up and wait that you can experience in some parts of the game. Cyberpunk is very much about the world and feeling real, and with that comes the passage of time and harder stopping points being implemented throughout. Many characters in the story ask you to wait for a call from them or to tell you to meet you in a couple of in-game days later at a different location. This gives you time to explore and do some of the seemingly hundreds of side and optional missions that crowd your map. Some players like myself love this. It gives me the rocket-fueled story in manageable chunks when I want it. But it also helps to make sure I don't just rush straight through the story all the time. For others, it can be a burden, breaking up the groove of their gameplay, though being able to just show up at a location and wait for a while helps to mitigate some of that time commitment if the hours are starting to stretch by and the sun starts to come up. There have been a lot of changes to the product released in 2020, and not just bug fixes and the occasional patch here and there. Cyberpunk 2.0, as it has been named, is a total refresh and overall upgrade to many of the base systems of the game. Many of the changes I mentioned in driving and gunplay are recent additions to the game with this update. There are many more new things to play with even outside of the DLC that really show the commitment that CDPR made to those that didn't give up on the game, and also to draw back in many players that wrote them off after the launch. Many of the changes are available for all players with the 2.0 update to the game, starting with one of the most fun new additions, combat while driving. Giving players the option of both precision aim and also focus on driving with a lock-on style of combat, the game opens up a lot of combat options while behind the wheel. The game also opens up a new set of missions for this DLC concerning, well, Grand Theft Auto. But the actual crime this time, not the Rockstar game franchise. It's not the most technical driving or combat system, but with the updates of the driving system overall, the addition feels good, and CDPR making good on an announcement promise is always great as well. Along with the overhaul to driving and the upgrades to combat, many of the customization options for a playthrough are also massively overhauled. From talents and cyberware to the weapons you use, everything has been changed up for what feels like the better. An all-new talent system that doesn't feel as cluttered and confusing as the initial iteration drives the bedrock of these changes. Skill points spent give a lot of new and interesting ways to play based on your preferred playstyle. Some of the choices in where talents lie still feel a bit lacking, but the overall feel and variety give a good starting ground for the rest of the changes to building your new character. New cyberware options and customizations allow for many different options to gearing your character. Now, how you look in game is almost completely up to you. No need to look like a cyber psycho just for stats from your gear. Almost all stats are based on your chrome now, and those components and what you can do with them are based on your stats. Think of them like enhancements to your overall build that can be changed out for different effects and style. Anything from additional hacking ability to speed and armor modifiers can be found in your cyberware, and what you can do with them feels almost endless at times. Different options for your ultimate abilities and how you utilize them are also built into this feature with new enhancements to the mantis blades, gorilla arms, and so on. The weapons you carry in your body aren't the only ones to rely on either. With new updates to the arsenal that you carry on you and updated usability and stat options on all weapons, getting your perfect loadout and enhancing it instead of just switching out weapons all the time feels great. In my base game playthrough, I felt like I never really had time to find a weapon or a set of them that I really liked and was able to stick with it. I was constantly cycling through different weapon types based purely on DPS. Now, the crafting and enhancement system has changed a lot of that for the better for me, allowing players to upgrade weapons in a less convoluted way and bringing up the playstyle that you like along with it. That enhancement system is used in more than just weapons as well. The tiers and how they upgrade over time is brought to many different places: weapons, cyberware, and hacks, just to name a few. Feel like your gun isn't quite cutting it anymore? Take a look in your inventory and see if you can level it up a couple times to get back your edge. Want to see if you can get a little more out of your cyberware? Hit up a Ripper dock and check out the upgrades that might be available to you. The systems here allow for almost unlimited customization and really bring out the best of Cyberpunk. The idea that humanity is enhanced and tech is there to help instead of just being on the outside of our personal existence. There's plenty that can get in the way of all that, and plenty more that can make it cause issue. Cyberpsychosis being one of the big drawbacks. But as you level and grow and develop your character, some of the wild upgrades you can make seem to make it all worth it. The newest addition to the Night City map is Dogtown, and it's just as rough as the name suggests. Many parts of the Night City map feel very diverse while holding together the overall feel of the city. Dogtown, however, feels very fringe compared to the rest of Night City, and that leads to my first real confusion in the game. Where is Dogtown? Is it another neighborhood in Night City, as some characters in the game suggest? Is it the equivalent of a suburb just outside of the city's boundary lines, but close enough for people to call it NC their home? But any real citizen of NC would never let them do that. Is it the part of the city that no one actually wants to claim? There are many hints to both sides of this throughout the story, and unfortunately it never really gets resolved in my eyes. It may be something that the lore and background of the Cyberpunk universe gets into, but not something that seemed to be very fleshed out in-game. That isn't to say that the zone itself isn't fleshed out. From the war-torn streets to the defunct sports stadium, Dogtown feels very much its own and part of the world. There really isn't another area in the game that feels quite like it. I wouldn't say that it's so different as to not feel like the rest of the game, but there are some parts that really make you question how connected these places are. Much of this comes down to the NPCs and enemies you find in the zone itself. Dogtown is under gang control, if you want to call it that. The main antagonist you fight, Hansen, is running this place with what seems like an iron fist, though there are some familiar faces, or hands, that are looking to take control over Dogtown. Some enemies and rivals from the base game make a comeback in Phantom Liberty as well, solidifying Dogtown's existence in the cyberpunk world, but still not helping to explain exactly where or what it's supposed to be. The tone and gravitas of the area feels like an endgame zone in many other RPGs. Enemies everywhere, groups always looking for a fight, random spawn events happening in the blink of an eye. It almost felt like I was playing Destiny at times, and not the RPG that I had spent hours in previously. The cast of characters that you meet in the DLC each have a lot going on as well. From past disputes with other characters to relationships and ties binding everyone together, these characters feel just as real in many ways, though much more grandiose, as the characters we met in the base game. That's a great thing for many of these characters and some of the high-tech shenanigans that they're able to get into. We dealt with characters in the base game that felt larger than life, but that theme seems to have been taken to the extreme here, with some of the characters almost duplicating some of the lines we dealt with in the base game. Attempting to become digital gods or warlords, sticking it to the corpo overlords, or even the new United States government. The first character of this new cast you meet is Song So-mi, also known as Songbird. After hacking into the relic and talking to us like a brand new Johnny, So-mi kicks off the story and is our main focal point through most of it. Even with some twists and turns, So-mi stays in the spotlight, just like Johnny in the base game. And just like Johnny, you can never really tell where her line in the sand is or what her real motives are. She is a force throughout the story, and one of the characters that you will always be looking to see more from, just like her boss, the new United States of America President, Rosalind Myers. Myers is absolutely a major player in this expansion, even if her grand total screen time is the least out of all the characters listed. Myers is well entwined in all of the aspects of the story, from the past, present, and future. Major explanations about the NUSA and how the government actually works inside and around Night City is explained through her story beats, and she, much like every other character in this game, is so morally gray you would think she's a caricature of the actual United States government. Which I guess she is in so many ways. Both what we see as the public or player and what is being kept from us, or the conspiracy theories that revolve around the real government, would have us believe. Rosalind isn't the only one with ties to the backstory of the Unification War and the cyberpunk lore overall. Hansen and his militia are all part of that story as well. A former colonel in the NUSA military, Hansen has that military dictator trope locked up tighter than entry into his fancy hotel abode. Explained throughout the story, with much of it coming from the mouth of the devil himself, Hansen was sent here on a mission, and when that mission was successful, he wanted to make sure he still had control. So he kept it, much to the chagrin of our new United States president friend. Acting as the main antagonist in the game, though there are some others as the story progresses, or depending on your take of the events that unfold, Hansen and his militia are a new force to be reckoned with in Cyberpunk that doesn't play well with others. He has many enemies and many friends, and all of them want a piece of the pie. With politicians, police, military, and even other gangs under his control, or at least his influence, he strikes a very strong figure and is a great, if very trope-heavy character to deal with your new federal agent buddy, Solomon Reed. Reed, played here by the incredibly talented Idris Elba, is your close companion throughout the gameplay. With his own backstory of loss and near-death experiences, he brings the I have a job to do attitude that you don't really find in other characters in this game. Many others in the cyberpunk world are out for themselves or suffer, ironically, from main character syndrome. And while Reed has his moments, his need to follow orders and get the job done while also keeping with his own ideals is what sets him apart from many other characters in both the base game and the expansion. But Solomon Reed isn't your only contact on the ground, giving you orders and sending you out for jobs. There's a fixer in Dogtown too, and is someone you may be familiar with. Mr. Hands comes more into play in the expansion than in the base game, with a great story about what he wants and what he plans to do to get it. He has many missions for you and sends the player out on a lot of different jobs and quests to get a feel for the world of Dogtown. But also as a keystone to Night City as a whole, instead of just dumping the player out with all the new characters, Mr. Hands is a welcome shadow reminding you where you are every so often and what your life outside of Dogtown is like. There is another, though, that really grounds you in the base game, and that, of course, is your own personal parasite, Johnny Silverhand. Now, it should go without saying that Keanu Reeves has once again nailed the character of Johnny here. The enigmatic former musician turned anti-corpo terrorist is still alive and kicking, sort of, as the game here continues. Johnny is just as opinionated as ever in the expansion story and always pops up to put in his 2 cents on every decision the player makes. Johnny also manages to show a little more color than his usual silver with the story here, talking in more sections about his time in the military, his opinions on the government and corpos, and every other anti-establishment ideal he believes in. A welcome face in the expansion, Johnny, just like the rest of the characters in game, is out for himself, but V is the driver here, and how the story plays out is still up to the player. Speaking of story, there's a lot to go through in Phantom Liberty, and much of it takes a very different path than the base game's long list of missions. In actuality though, I put almost as much time into this story as I did the base game. The story gets up and running quickly from the first mind-breaking hack into the relic you experience to the end of the story. There's a lot going on, and many places to get sidetracked in. Gigs and side jobs are all over, and dynamic events pop up often for you to turn your attention to. The story itself follows V and Johnny into the noir-like espionage of the NUSA government, and a plot to kidnap, if not kill, the president, starting off with a literal bang as Space Force 1. The president's aerial transport is blown out of the sky, crashing into Dogtown and causing every chrome junkie around to go running for loot and spoils. V is contacted by Songbird with a plea to save President Myers from the wreckage and get her to safety with a promise of a cure for the relic if all goes well. Diving headfirst into Dogtown, V is confronted with many choices and morally gray options that Johnny loves to try to talk the player into and out of. President Myers is saved, but not out of the woods yet, and Songbird is nowhere to be found, and it's now your problem to get in touch with a burned agent that is still skulking about in Dogtown for help. Solomon Reed. A former agent of the FIA and pawn of Myers with a sordid past around his job, Myers, and Songbird, Reed has trust issues to say the least, and needs some proof and reason to get himself back into the life. Myers recruits you for this mission and tasks Reed with getting her out of town and finding Songbird for the sake of the NUSA and Night City both. The player comes to find out that Somi is being held by Hansen for his own domination dreams, and depending on your actions in the missions overall, any number of characters can get the ending they desire or the one they deserve. The story overall feels like the opening missions of the base game. Heists, double crosses, deceit, and crime all run through the veins of this story, but on a much grander scale than the seedy underworld of Night City, with a focus on the implications for NUSA and even the world in some cases. Much of the game almost feels like Metal Gear Solid, with its grand implications, technological miracles, corrupt governments, and the spy thriller story really lends to that. Many of the characters lead to that feel, with major players seeming to come out of the woodwork, and new characters from new parts of the Cyberpunk universe start peeking up, possibly hinting at the future games and stories to be told in this universe. Time and CD Projekt Red are the only ones that can tell us that, but after how this story unfolds and expands, it would be a crime not to give the fans more. I guess we'll have to wait and see how the world grows even further. It almost hurts to say that this game wouldn't be Cyberpunk without technical issues, and I'm sure CD Projekt Red doesn't want to be hearing that, especially after the incredible amount of work they have put into the game to get it to the state it's in with Phantom Liberty. Unfortunately for them, there are still plenty of issues that plague the game, though none of them feel as game-breaking as the initial launch of the game did, so that's a win in my book. There's plenty of optimizations that could be made to the game, from AI issues and seeming logic breaks for some of the NPCs running around in the world, instances of non-reactive NPCs when everyone else seems to be running to the hills to save their lives. Those are more things you notice and walk by though. In some cases you may not even notice. But there are some bigger hitches and glitches that I experienced with my time in the game that really just shook me out of it. Now, there are some caveats to that. I stream and record on one PC, and go into every game like I'm playing it without doing that, and expecting my system to just handle it. I then go in and change settings to get the best balance of performance and quality. Call it a stress test, but one thing I think needs to be noted for all of this is I am playing on all AMD hardware. I know, a sin to most people. The game is more optimized for NVIDIA cards, and that's fine, my choice and all that. The thing is, some of the issues I experienced during my gameplay with the expansion are the same issues I experienced on my previous gen NVIDIA system during the base game. I'm not crazy enough to try and play this game at high frame rate with ray tracing, but some of the issues have been around since base game. From hitches and glitches with textures to frame timings and lag and the awful bloom effects that seemingly pop up out of nowhere. The game could use a bit more polish overall, and realistically, I think CDPR is doing well for how huge this game is and technically impressive it is set out to be. The scope creep of many parts may have been to their detriment with the initial launch, and now that we have some of those features in the DLC, I'm not really sure it was worth it or added as much to the experience as much as another coat of polish could have. All in, Phantom Liberty is a great experience. Realistically, it adds a lot of new features and gameplay to the base game that could have used it, but given that it was a broken mess when it first launched and the state it's in now is far better, I can see why CDPR took that time and waited. It's a fantastic addition that turns the look and feel of the base game on its head and still manages to hold on to what made the game good. After all that, and after doubling my time in Cyberpunk, I really think that it was absolutely worth the upgrade, and CDPR did a great job kind of bringing everything together that they wanted from the initial launch with, you know, a couple coats of polish and making it realistically a good game.